Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives for our program on Congressional Review, Can Congress Function at its Highest Level? Whether you're here in the McGowan Theater or watching us on YouTube, thank you for joining us. We're presenting this program in partnership with our friends at the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, and we thank them for their support. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two programs coming up later this month in this theater. On Tuesday, June 6th at noon, award-winning historian Daniel Mark Epstein will discuss his new book, The Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House, which tells the story of Franklin's illegitimate son, William. And on Thursday, June 15th at 7 p.m., we continue our celebration of the 100th birthday of John F. Kennedy with a concert presented by the Air Force Strings, the official string ensemble of the U.S. Air Force Band. The concert will include selections that were performed in the Kennedy White House. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs, and there are applications for membership in the lobby. For decades before the National Archives was established, and long before this building was conceived, the records of our national government were scattered among offices, attics, basements, and even garages belonging to various agencies. The records of the United States Congress were no luckier. Storage rooms throughout the U.S. Capitol were stuffed with papers dating back to the beginning of our government. Once the National Archives was up and running, the Senate transferred its historical records to us, and the House followed suit in 1946. Among the thousands of cubic feet of congressional records here are committee records, journals, bills, resolutions, and electoral votes dating to the first Congress in 1789. Today, the Center for Legislative Archives within the National Archives preserves and makes available to researchers these incomparable historical records of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. We are proud of our long-standing relationship with Congress in safeguarding the records of its activities. To get tonight's discussion started, we'll now turn to Martin Frost, the Vice President of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Martin Frost.
Well, thank you. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to be here at the Archives. You all do wonderful work, and you put on some pretty good programs from time to time. In fact, they were kind enough to put on a program when a book that I wrote about congressional reform called The Partisan Divide, Congress in Crisis, I co-wrote it with Tom Davis, former Republican member. They were kind enough to put on a program in this very room when the book was issued a couple of years ago. As was mentioned, I'm the Vice President of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. And again, I want to welcome you to tonight's panel on congressional reform. It is a privilege to introduce this discussion as a former representative of the 24th District of Texas that I represented for 26 years. This evening's event is presented to you by the National Archives in partnership with the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, the Aspen Institute, the Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group, and the Democracy Fund, the Congressional Institute, and the Hewlett Foundation's Madison Initiative. On behalf of the former members of Congress, I would like to acknowledge our partnership, as I mentioned a little bit ago, these past years with the National Archives, and want to express our sincere gratitude for the Archives for working with us through the years to provide informational events regarding the institution of Congress, and thank you very much for doing that. The U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress works to promote public service as well as strengthen representative democracy domestically and abroad. Even more so, former members of Congress keeps former members of Congress connected after their service in events such as tonight's panel. Their goal, and this evening's goal, is to foster a discussion of democracy from those who have seen the institution in action. alongside with you, an audience of voters who should be heard just as loudly on this subject. This particular panel will focus on Congress and the roles of the media, constituents, and leadership in both parties, promoting the passage of bipartisan legislation when possible. Our panelists will delve further into successful reforms of the past, and particularly the reforms that are needed today. Our panelists this evening include former members of Congress, Bob Walker from Pennsylvania, Steve Horsford from Nevada, as well as current House Chief of Staff to Representative Lipinski, Eric Loston, and former Chief of Staff of Senator Mark Kirk, Kate Dickens. I will now hand it off to our panel moderator, associate editor, and columnist at Real Clear Politics, A.B. Stoddard. Once again, thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you, Congressman Frost. I'm only 21 years old, but I'm somehow old enough to have covered Congress and covered Congressman Frost when he was in the House, and he was a great member, and I've had the opportunity to enjoy working with him now and then, and I want you all, if you have not yet read his book that he co-authored with Congressman Tom Davis of Virginia, The Partisan Divide, if you want to learn exactly about what's happened to our system and how and why everything has changed so quickly and so much. It is really the best encyclopedia of and study of the Congress and what's happened to it, so I recommend it highly. We're going to start off this evening. I'm going to start with Congressman Walker. One of the things that I've noticed is that everyone at the rallies, when they do man on the streets, talking to people who didn't vote for President Trump, voted for President Trump, what's everyone waiting for? It's a fix to Obamacare and tax reform. Everyone's waiting for their goodies and their fixes. But what I don't think the members are telling everyone back home is that they have a whole mess of stuff to get through this summer in regards to funding the government, budget processes and deadlines and hurdles ahead that are going to be enormously time-consuming and very politically difficult. And so we're looking now, actually, before the August recess, at the need to raise the debt ceiling, a toxic vote for everybody, as we know. This will require the help of Democrats. At the same time, Republicans want to break those sequester caps from 2011, and they need to fix, with legislation and 60 votes in the Senate with Democrats, the Budget Control Act of 2011. This is going to take bipartisanship. This is also supposed to, they want to make that deal with the debt ceiling hike before the August recess. And after that, they need to get to this famous, let's do a continuing resolution, which is a bunch of, spending bills 12 that were supposed to be passed separately, but it hasn't happened since 1997, get smashed into a bigger one, and then they just do it at midnight to avert a government shutdown. But what people don't probably understand, because we've gotten so used to that life on a cliff, is that the Congress's primary role is to fund the government really by authorization. And I want you to talk a little bit about that process, what's happened to that, and why it's so essential to governance, and why it's the most important role of the Congress, and why, without doing it, we just make a more powerful executive branch.
One of the most fundamental things in the whole history of the Congress is that you set policy before you spend money. And the idea is that in the authorization process, and the authorizing committees are the large number of committees in the Congress that have jurisdiction over various departments and agencies. They are supposed to set the policy. Now, they can set the policy for 1 year, they could set the policy for 4 or 5 years, but nevertheless, they need to put a policy in place. And then the idea is that you put the spending bills behind that, and that you go ahead and spend the money pursuant to the policies that Congress has adopted and that the President has signed into law. The problem that we've gotten into in recent years is the fact that the authorizing process isn't working. That we're not obeying those rules, and we're not saying that in order to spend the money, and this is one of the rules that exists in the Congress, in order to spend the money, to appropriate money, an authorization has to be in place. But what we do when we bring the rules packages to the House floor, we simply waive that rule and say, well, there's no authorization. And some of our departments and agencies haven't been authorized for 3 or 4 decades. I think as a result, we've lost control of the ability of Congress to make real decisions because, as you point out, at the end of the day, everything now is jammed into omnibus spending bills. They don't even pass the individual spending bills. At least we used to do that. We used to be able to get the individual spending bills out on the floor and debate those. But nowadays, everything gets jammed into one huge bill. It would be probably ridiculous to think that anybody knows what is in that final product. It contains both policy and spending. And I just think that's a system that is totally broken and can't work. So one of the chief reforms I think we've got to get to is to say we're going to do what we say in our basic rules. We're going to begin authorizing before we appropriate.
And Congressman, you were not around for the glory days of authorization, but obviously, as Congressman Walker points out, it's supposed to keep a check on these agencies. These committees house the experts, both the members and their staff. They're checking up on these agencies, on these programs, seeing which ones need to be pared back, which ones need to be bolstered. It's supposed to be a constantly sort of organic process where there's oversight of you're the stewards of the taxpayer dollar, and talk a little bit about the process that you saw and why in the end, if it's so centralized and so rushed through the floor at the last minute or in a small meeting with the administration at the 11th hour, the members don't spend time with each other, they're not part of the legislation, and that starts the breakdown.
Well, I agree very much with Congressman Walker that the system is broken. And prior to coming to Congress, that's what a lot of constituents back home said. But I will say that while the process is broken, there are people in the process who I believe are committed to wanting to make it better. And there are more members who want to preserve and strengthen the institution than there are members who want to tear it down or tear it apart. And I think we beat up too much on Congress. It is an important role that it plays, but these are some fundamental things that have failed to be done over time that has created this feeling in the American electorate that the government's broken and it's not working properly. What I found when I came here as a freshman is that, first of all, it's too partisan. Getting here required a whole lot of campaign contributions, and that drives a lot of the process. And then this idea that they only can work 3 days a week in D.C. and the rest of the time you're in your home district didn't make a lot of sense to me when my primary job was to represent 677,000 constituents who wanted me doing a job back in D.C. But yet, we were spending more time in our home districts. And that doesn't allow for members to get to know each other. It doesn't allow for kind of the real process of governing to occur. Too much of the process has been taken away from the committees and is now in leadership. And there's resentment by members and committee chairs and others that process has been taken from them and that they can't do their jobs as members in representing their constituents back home.
And Kate, one of the problems with, and we can talk about campaign finance later, but one of the problems that prevails, and we were just talking about it beforehand, is the protection of members who come from super safe districts and come here to do one thing, which is often to vote no, but they are really watching their back only for that primary vote. I think 9% of the country voted to choose Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in the presidential primary process. They are just this is just a partisan process. Very few people, how many people in this room have voted in their congressional primary? Okay, well, you're active, engaged people from the Beltway, maybe, out in the hinterlands, right? I think a lot of people just don't even really know which day their primary is falling on. That this is still driven, right, by by invested partisans who keep who drive the policy, the voting record of the member, because they don't want to get primaried from their right or from their left. So, if you can talk about how you saw that in your work on the Hill, how you see that affecting the problem, and do constituents really understand that? I mean, when they call the office, when they're upset with the member or they want some action on this or that, do they even really understand how many of them are just sort of gerrymandered out of the process because only 21% of us, I think the number's less now, can actually even flip a district on election day?
Well, one thing I think that's hard for us to kind of accept is that each one of us as constituents, as voters, probably have these same adamant positions in our own minds when we, not that I've ever called my member of Congress and yelled at the staff on the phone, but when they do that, they don't say, you know, hey, I'd really like you to balance out both sides and really come to a balanced decision, and I trust you to do your best and put us first. No one calls to say that. You know, there's an anger from the people that vote for you on both sides. And so I think it's a very natural thing. I don't like it, and I don't think that many people in Washington, you know, I would hope the majority of the members of Congress, and I would hope the majority of Americans are frustrated by it, but there's a reason for all of it, and I don't know that there's, I mean, if Washington is in every member of district, in every member of Congress district, or in every state, the voters speak loudly and it matters to the member. And whatever they hear traditionally drives the member. And there's not this massive movement afoot to be bipartisan. There's not, there's no big money behind it. There's no bubbling sense, it's not covered on the news 24/7. It's not something that you feel palpable. People really want this change. I don't know that there is this big movement. Maybe it's because there's not a passion behind it. It's the apathetic middle that's the majority. But, I think that you can make an excuse for basically all of it.
So, Eric, I think Kate is making a good point, which is that people who want the wings, the extremes, make their voices heard the loudest, obviously. They participate in primaries. But there is a sense that, obviously, the majority of the country is disgusted with congressional gridlock and polarization and the paralysis. And so your boss, as I understand it, is a member of the Problem Solver Caucus. I do a lot of work with No Labels, and they're trying to stick their necks out. There's 20 R's, 20 D's in the House in the Problem Solvers Caucus, and they're trying to vote as a block on big issues, if three-fourths of them can get to a position, as I understand it. Tell me about your perception of the appetite for some kind of reforms to the body. Forget the coming votes, on the agenda in the Problem Solvers, but what you see, there's your boss and Congressman LaHood have a bill out for a joint commission on congressional reforms that would be bicameral and bipartisan, right. So for the whole body. And what are the kinds of things, we know the problems, but what are the kinds of things that could begin to break through some of the problems that are institutional now?
Well, I think that if you were to poll members of Congress, I'd be surprised if you found any of them that said that the system works ideally, that it's perfect. That each one will have some recommendation for the process, the system, the institution working better. But each of them are going to be distinct from their perspective, their point of view, or their districts that they come from. So what Congressman LaHood and Congressman Lipinski are working on is a resolution that would create a joint committee on the organization of Congress, bicameral, bipartisan body, 12 from each side, that would be in place for one session of Congress to be sort of the recipient of everybody's suggestions about how to make Congress work better. And those are going to run a gamut of very political things like redistricting or campaign finance reform to the more mundane internal things like what are the committee processes? Are there Should there be term limits for committee chairmen? What kind of turnover should you have? What kind of capacity should you have in staff in terms of how many and what their capabilities are, and are there training and opportunities for that? This has been done 3 other times in the past century, in 1946, 1965, and then in 1992 and 93, and they resulted in a lot of the things that we sort of take for granted nowadays in terms of committees being transparent, having open hearings. It used to be a lot of committee hearings were private, closed. That roll call votes and the outcomes of committee markups of bills would be published in a report. That the minority in the House would have the opportunity to offer a motion to recommit. Those are all things that came out of the joint committees of the past. So, it's hard to put a finger on what exactly could come out of a process like that this time around. You could think of a multitude of different topics or areas that the Joint Committee could explore. And so we're working to try and build support for that now, and we're hopeful that that might be something that provides some forum for members of Congress to look at and say, yeah, there's an opportunity for us to try and make our institution function better.
Well, I want to return to you later on the challenges of the committee staff and their work burden and level of expertise. Congressman, one of the things that you have talked about being an important reform would be to mitigate or limit the time that people are fundraising on legislative days. Talk a little bit about it, if you can.
Well, I just think that the fundraising process is totally out of hand, that the members feel as though they're fundraising machines rather than legislators.
I think they spend only a third of their time legislating and doing oversight now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a real problem. And as you talk to members on the Hill, you find out that they are really focused on the fact that they're not spending their time legislating. They're not a part of the policy process, but instead are expected to go raise money for their next campaign. And the campaigns have become so expensive that you have some concern about that. And so I understand their frustration. I also understand that the system is geared toward that kind of a process right now. I think where one of the mistakes was made was back 40 years ago when we did the so-called reforms back in the 1974 time period, and at that time basically undermined the political parties. In the days before that, political parties did a lot of the fundraising. A lot of the money came through the parties and so on, and the members were not spending a lot of time raising money. I was an aide back during that time. My boss raised very little money. I ran my first primary campaign in 1976 on $13,000. The fact is the parties raised the money, and then their endorsements meant something. And so when you talk about the fact that in the primaries the members are concerned about somebody coming up and knocking them off from one of the wings, well, one of the solutions to that back in those days was you had party endorsements that meant something, and it was very difficult for somebody, even somebody with a lot of money, to come in and overcome the party. And so as we have destroyed some of the ability of the party to be the fundraising mechanism for candidates, we have also then put more of the burden on the candidates themselves, and now they're spending a lot of time raising money for hugely expensive campaigns. The district that I represented, where I spent $13,000 in my first primary, the overall election campaign this past year was over $2 million. So
they're getting more expensive. Congressman, in your experience, I'm sure you were obviously served in the most recent pressure of fundraising, and you know this cycle. A couple things, what Congressman Walker said is interesting. I mean, I think that obviously the parties were able, if they were doing the fundraising, to exert more control. And I think the duopoly is failing and dying. And I think that the Democratic Party almost didn't stave off an insurgent, and the Republican Party could not stave off an insurgent. And so I think that their power is just vastly diminished.
But if I just could, I mean, but part of the problem there is the fact that the party organizations then atrophy as well. If they're not the prime fundraising apart, their whole organizations, the committee people, all of that atrophy, and so it has impacts well beyond than just the congressional races.
Right, right. So in your experience, do you have any ideas about how things could change? I think you both believe in an expanded work week, and that would probably be one of the reforms that the commission would want to encourage and promote. But what were your thoughts when you were there about how the fundraising should be restructured? Or, I mean, obviously we'd love to snap our fingers and have it be gone, but what's your perspective on how to get out of this hole?
Well, I came from one of those purple districts. And so I spent 25 to 30 hours a week fundraising, usually in a cubicle in a very dark room without even a window. And my staff would bring me lunch because they would want to keep me on the phones dialing for dollars. Having come from the state legislature, serving 8 years in the state legislature, I thought that was an insult to my role as a public servant of my constituents to spend more time raising money than doing constituent work. We have to reform Citizens United. It needs to be overturned. It's one of the worst decisions that's affecting money in politics. The fact that in my case, my race cost me $2.5 million. On top of that, third parties on my behalf spent another $2.5 to $3 million. On the other side, they spent almost $5 million against me. My last election, one super PAC came in and spent $1.5 million in the last 10 days of the election. That's broken. One person, one wealthy individual, or a group of wealthy individuals that are part of a super PAC should not have more of a voice in the process than the voters who turn out to vote. And part of the reason more people don't turn out is because they're disgusted by how much money is influencing the process. Now, I didn't want to spend all that time raising money, but my staff told me that if you didn't, you weren't going to come back. And that was not, something that I felt terribly good about, but it was necessary. So I think fundamentally changing the campaign finance reform is important, but in order to do that, I think we also have to restructure these gerrymander districts, and they're on both sides. One of the reasons there's not more bipartisanship is because people aren't governing to the middle. They're governing to the primary of their districts. When I first came as a freshman, we had orientation. One retreat was bipartisan with all of the colleagues together. After that, everything was done by party. Even the freshman dinner where the speaker comes, at the time, Speaker Boehner, he didn't come to our dinner. I thought he was the speaker of the body, not the speaker of a party. And that sent the first signal to me that this is more about partisanship than it is about finding ways to govern in the middle. Now, like I said, there are more members who want to govern in the middle, but they're not incentivized to do so by leadership or really by the process. So those things fundamentally have to change.
And I would just add another reference, another material here for any of those interested in the gerrymandering subject. I highly recommend that you look at the new updated partisan voting index that the Political Report put out, because it actually shows to be in a swing district, you have to have a PVI of plus or -4, I believe. Paul Ryan's in like a +4 or 5 district. He is in a swing district. Nancy Pelosi's in a +36. She's in one of the most partisan districts in the entire House. And so when you look at where people's perspectives are coming from, she doesn't get primaried anyway, but if you look at some, it's also an interesting topic just because when President Obama comes out of his his planned silent period is, he and the former Attorney General Eric Holder are going to actually do a public campaign about gerrymandering to try to teach voters about gerrymandering. It won't change before the next census, but they want to sort of lay the groundwork for rebuilding the party eventually. But it is an interesting topic, and it really is interesting about as you're a member and you're in there and you learn who's coming from a plus 29 and who's coming from a plus 2. That makes a big difference about where they're going to start, making concessions.
But
and working
most of
together.
those districts are drawn by state legislatures.
Right.
And so for voters who are concerned about how Congress is working, they also need to be looking at what's the makeup of the state legislatures who are actually going to be responsible for drawing the majority of these lines.
Right. And those legislatures want to keep that power. Now, Kate and Eric, back to sort of what it's like to work in Congress and what's happened to the actual institution in terms of what the efficacy of the institution. The members, as we know, are in a dark room dialing for dollars, and the staff has been cut back considerably in recent decades. Resources have been cut back. And important agencies like CRS and CBO and these really vital institutions are shrinking as well. What is it like with the high turnover, the low pay, and the just incredibly rapid change that we have going on in all these different industries, and how the Congress is supposed to be reacting and adapting in terms of lawmaking? What is it like from a staff perspective about what needs to change to make it a more solid place where work can be done, a bit protected from the waves of people coming in and out and worrying about their partisan hides the whole time?
Well, I remember moving when I left the House and started working in the Senate. There was a shift around that period, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where it wasn't basically acceptable to have a lot of staff in the House. Senate never really caught on to that trend, but in the House it became, you shouldn't have a lot of staff.
Right, because you need a small government.
Right, and one of the, it's not that they're turning the money necessarily back into the Treasury, because that's a whole other issue on itself that you can't, but it became, we could be spending the money on telephone town halls or glossy mailers. So you could spend half of your budget on campaign type mailers or telephone town halls and have half the staff. You can have 2 or 3 legislative staffs for the entire issues, all of them, and maybe 1 press person and a scheduler, and that would be it, which is just insane. And then the average age, I think, of a House staffer is like 27 years old.
And they're just not investing in that brain power and keeping them there.
What could we expect? I mean, no offense to these, this average 27-year-old that works on the Hill, works on the House side. I think it's 31 in the Senate, these people work their butts off for nothing, and except for an amazing experience. Don't get me wrong, but what can we expect? And not to mention that the schedule of a member of Congress is 18-hour days. It's the busiest. They get a bad rap for this schedule, but they're the hardest working people probably on the planet in many ways. In the days, at least, the people that I've worked for, it's an exhausting schedule that no person could really keep up with if they, tried to duplicate that schedule. In terms of the fundraising, it's a necessary evil. I don't know a better way. I don't know, campaign finance reform that we did before. I don't know that solved anything. We had the Disclose Act, and there was, this is the frustrating part of this whole debate as a whole, is we can agree on the problems, but we can never agree on the solutions. And it always breaks down as soon as we start talking about the solutions, we immediately have ideologies that bring us to our party's more common ideology. If you have the Disclose Act, okay, let's shut this down, but then the union part doesn't count, and then it's, then that falls apart. So there's no, there's will, but I don't know that there's necessarily a better solution. Privatizing the campaign process certainly isn't going to put us in a better place. I mean, if you break down the party structure too much, there's a lot of good that can come out of that, but then you have who of each party controlling outside of the parties, but who in what business interests or who in what ideological interests, then funding it, because the gap will be filled.
And Eric, can you address these two questions? One is the willingness is different than the need, but talk about committee capacity and the high turnover and the sort of what results from that. At the same time, if the Congress isn't legislating anyway, is there going to be a willingness to sort of beef up staff, provide them with the resources that they need, invest in their tenure so that you get the best experts? If you could just address those two things. I don't know about the willingness. I see the need, but I see why also, particularly Republicans, think that you need to keep trimming the numbers.
Right. Well, there was a small glimmer of hope. Last year, the House, under Republican control, did increase the funding for the legislative branch staff account a small amount. This was after a fairly big 20% cut that I think we got in 2010, which was really hard to absorb because our budgets are pretty static. We're paying for things like rent and the members' travel, that you can't change those numbers so much. And then you have personnel, and that becomes the place where you tighten your belt. And so you're paying people less for an already fairly austere salary. And so you have turnover, which is fairly rapid already. I think the average term of a staffer on the Hill is something like 2 years. And I've been there 14, so that means that you've got folks that are doing 6 or 9 months and saying, no, this is not for me. We have attorneys, people who have law degrees, smart people, PhDs who make who took huge salary cuts to come and work on the Hill because it is a great experience, and you can't expect them to stay in those positions too long. And so you want them to stay around because we deal with things that have historical constructs in terms of where the member voted and why they voted on certain things 2, 3, 4 years ago, and it's hard to remember why that was if that staff person has moved on. And there are some really challenging issues. The Dodd-Frank bill on financial services, one of the most complex pieces of legislation I can remember us dealing with. That staff person's gone. Next week we may be dealing with the bill that would undo Dodd-Frank, and so we have to go back and remember why it was the boss felt a certain way about things. But increasingly the things we're dealing with are very complex, be it net neutrality or the Iranian nuclear deal or other things of that nature. And so when you don't have the capacity in your own office to assess that and figure out why the member felt a certain way in the past or understand the technical implications of things, you're looking to other sources. And that might be the committees of jurisdiction, it could be CRS, the Office of Technology Assessment that was done away with in the mid-90s, which was a congressional office that provided technical guidance to members of Congress on these topics. And as they've shrunk, then you have fewer and fewer internal institutional sources of information that you can trust and then you put some objectivity on. So that means that members' offices are then looking to what we call stakeholders on the outside, which tend to be not objective, but very subjective interests, lobbyists and people who work for companies or trade associations that have a perspective on this. And so they're going to give you information that you have to try and suss out its truth versus its influence. And so that makes members more beholden to the institutions that I think, or the stakeholders that many outside of Congress think are the ills that make Congress less trustworthy.
Congressman Walker, how do you feel as a Republican looking back in terms of the idea that, what we know, that the staff has shrunk, that they are not sort of buttressed against not only power shifts, but their boss leaving or whatever goes on. And so you're not building up that institutional knowledge, not of what the boss might have thought, but just actually of that law itself or that industry. Do you think that the committees of jurisdiction, particularly the authorizing committees, need more capacity? They need more resources invested in attracting experts, keeping them longer, so that the individual members who are fundraising all the time and just got there, 18 months ago, can have an expert at their side that's not going to leave and get...
Well, a couple of things. First of all, one of the reasons why Congress doesn't spend as much money as they probably should on it themselves is because if you're cutting HHS, you will get some story that says, here they are, they're raising the amount of money they're spending
Very
while you're
true.
cutting the executive branch. And it's, because it's an easy story to write and so on. And so the fact is the institution is very sensitive
Yeah.
to those kinds of things. Secondly, on the committee staffs, there are a lot of more permanent staff. I was visiting my old committee the other day with the staff people, and there are people there who were on the committee staff when I left 20 years ago.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. If
So
they know something.
but these people are very valuable, and they bring institutional knowledge. A lot of the turnover is in the individual member staff.
Right, the personal
and that's where you see that, and where you see a lot of the low pay, and there it is still a problem. Now, I will say, in terms of finding expertise, look, when I was ranking member of the Science Committee or chairman of the Science Committee, I could call every Nobel Prize winner in the world, and they would take my call. The fact is, the ability of members of Congress to reach out beyond lobbyists and beyond a lot of other things and so on is infinite. I mean, you really do have the ability to bring a lot of expertise in. The question is whether or not you have the time to really do everything that's available to you in terms of getting expertise. So part of this is figuring out how you balance a staff that gives you the expertise immediately that you need to draw expertise from the outside.
And I want to ask you about quickly on budget reform, and you can both address that if you will. I mean, obviously the budget is what is always in the way. So people talk about biennial budgeting. Is there any reform you think that would make sense in terms of ameliorating this constant cliff crisis mode that we're in, that sort of really just clears out any space or time for other bills? I mean, the last big bills we had were the Dodd-Frank and Obamacare in that stretch. We haven't really, I mean, how do you do a heavy lift when the budget is always going to break, the calendar?
Well, I mean, the budget process, first of all, I mean, between the Budget Act and the appropriations,
right.
I mean, the Budget Act itself is broken. Whatever we call them now, the 301Bs or whatever that have to get to do the distribution and so on. It's become kind of a joke by the time it gets to the Appropriations Committee, because the Appropriations Committee often it gets there late.
Yep.
The Appropriations Committee has already done the work.
Yep.
They're not about to change that direction, and so a lot of the mechanisms that were put in place to assure some kind of continuity in the budget process just isn't working, which is the reason why, again, I come back to the fact that if we were authorizing, and if you were putting policy in place, and if you were assured that a policy bill was in place before you went to appropriate, then at that point, you would have a system that works. But you're right. I mean, the timing to do that, given how we press everything into the latter part of the week. You were talking earlier about the fact that here we are, this is all the things that we have to get done this summer. Well, there are about 7 weeks left of this summer of legislative weeks.
There are 31 days, and then I think there's only 31 days for the recess and 43 legislative days before September 29th, before September 30th.
Yeah. I mean, so you take the list that you talked about a few minutes ago, and you say all of this has to get crammed into that, and then you take the problem of the fact that we don't work very long legislative weeks, but having been in the leadership offices when we had to set the schedule, believe me, that is one of the most difficult things that goes on in the Congress.
Yeah.
For the majority leader and the Senate and the Speaker each week to set that legislative schedule. You lay out a schedule, and pretty soon somebody comes in and it says, well, my grandson is graduating from 3rd grade on that day, and I'm already committed to being there, and so on. How can you have session because my bill is supposed to be on the floor that day? And you're balancing that for 435 people, all of whom have their own idea of what the schedule looks like. And so the 3 days that are laid out, then you run into the problem of the West Coast guys saying, okay, I don't have to come back till Tuesday, but don't schedule anything for votes until at least 5 o'clock on Tuesday until the planes get in. And then, oh, by the way, I need to leave by 3 o'clock on Thursday because the last plane headed for the West Coast leaves at 4 o'clock. I mean, you're constantly balancing all of that as a part of trying to come up with a schedule that works. And it really is one of the most difficult things the leadership
And we're
has
not
to do.
likely, right, I mean, you moved here to stay here on the weekends, but we're not likely, everyone's going back. So we're not likely to go back. I was on the radio today with Congressman Bart Gordon, your old Science Committee colleague from Tennessee, Democrat. He said that back in the day when everyone lived with each other, next to each other, he wrote a letter of recommendation for Roy Blunt's son to get into preschool. I mean, they were stuck with each other, and then they weren't mean to each other, and then they actually did more legislating, of course. So the rush to get the last 2 o'clock plane on Thursday or whatever it is, right? We're not going to get them back here, right? That ship has sailed, right? They're always going to stay.
I push back on that a little bit, though, because, again, from my perspective, being one of those West Coast members, I didn't come here with an expectation that I'm going to get in here on Tuesday and leave by Thursday.
Right.
I came with the expectation that I'm going to work whenever we're supposed to be in session. And I think it was actually Newt Gingrich in 1994 that imposed this Tuesday through Thursday schedule and that pushed people back to their home districts. And when I got elected, I decided to relocate my family here for the very reason you just said. The old school way of getting to know people, I thought I would be able to see my family more by having them here.
Right.
But then I realized, oh, we're back in the home district more than I am here in session.
Right.
I know that we say that there aren't solutions out there. I think there are people that have offered very concrete solutions. Professor Jim Thurber at the American University has written a whole book about American gridlock and has outlined a number of key recommendations. He just spoke to the 115th session of the Congress, the freshman Congress, to outline some of the things that they can do. I don't think that there's the political will, and I do think it starts at the top with leadership on both sides of the aisle, because some of the decisions that they're making are not in the best interest of their members. They're not in the best interest of them getting reelected. And they're more focused about keeping their power than they are about pushing that power out to the members. And that goes back to the budget process. We need to bring back earmarks.
Yeah.
We need to...
That'd be a disaster.
No, we need to, because it allows people to legislate, to govern. I chaired the Finance Committee in the State Senate, and it allowed me to make deals with the colleagues I needed to make deals with. Now it's rests with just a small group of individuals to decide what's going to be in a spending bill and what's not.
No, that's an interesting point. There's a real argument against them, and there's a real argument for bringing them back, because I was talking with someone about tax reform today. They're going to have to go vote shopping on tax reform. Everybody's got a sacred cow, and they're all lined up. And which sacred cow is going to get killed? None of them. And you think the Trump administration is being bold? They have taken so many things off the table. Oh, we're not going to do this, not going to do that. They already have a big pile of sacred cows. So when's everyone going to get tough? So they're going to go vote shopping on tax reform.
But one of the reasons why we got to where we are with the appropriators driving everything is because of earmarks.
Right.
The appropriators took it on themselves and so on to say, come to us with all of your things and so on, and we'll work it all out.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to have people get things done for their district as a part of the authorization process, and the things that you want are a part of a policy process, but you may be able to work out something like that.
Right.
But I mean, I literally saw, as somebody looking at the thing from the science perspective, I saw earmarks in appropriation bills that had failed the peer review process. And so therefore, were things that were put in there. There were projects put in for universities where, when the press called the university to say, what are you going to do with this money? They said, what money? We didn't even know we were going to get it. So I mean, there's a real problem if what you do is put everything over to appropriations, and that's how we got there. We got there through the earmark process.
All right,
I
you
think
go
it's
on.
a balance because it's, yes, we need policy-driven
Yeah.
decisions, but this is a political process.
Right.
And in order to move members and get them on board and get things done, you need to have incentives
Right.
to get things done. And
Right.
since they've done the moratorium, that's contributed to further breakdown of the process. I'd rather be able to negotiate with the appropriator to get something in than to not be able to get anything done because nothing's moving at all.
Right. Now you're both for expanding the work week, and I just want to. Are
Yeah,
you?
no, sure,
Yeah.
no,
So-
but let me just say, the Tuesday Thursday Club was there for many, many years. When I arrived in Congress as an aide in 1967, the Tuesday Thursday Club existed. It was for the East Coast guys. The East, you went about as far west as the Mississippi River, but everybody kind of east of the Mississippi went home on the weekends and usually went home on Fridays. And came back Monday nights and so on. I mean, you had real legislative days Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, instead of just one real legislative day on Wednesday that we have now. But Tuesday, Thursday Club's been around for a long, long time. And what Newt attempted to do was to make it real and make certain that you had real legislating happening on Tuesday, Thursday, or Tuesday through Thursday, and that the committees had time to meet. The way it's set up right now, the committees can't even find time to meet.
I know.
Because literally the only day that they have
Wednesday,
is Wednesday.
and then they're all
Yep,
doing
yep.
Wednesday. So let's just go down the row here on what's known as regular order, because all we want is regular order, but when a party gets in, they promise regular order, and then it blows up. So, Eric, how do we get to regular order? Why is it so hard to return to what once worked sort of well? If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think there's probably a number of causes for the breaking down, and I think one is just the desire of leadership and the caucuses that are willing to get things done. And going through regular order doesn't always result in the outcome you hope it does when you start the process. And that's both good for the public and I think the institution, but bad for those who are seeking to have control and get the outcomes that they want. And so that has devolved the power upwards into the leadership away from the committees a little bit so that they can have a hand on the bills, guiding them to assure the outcomes that they want. And I think that the proliferation of sort of these sub-caucuses within the Democrat and Republican Party of the Freedom Caucus, Progressive Caucus, and Blue Dogs, however you sort of slice and dice them, sort of contributes to that because you have these blocks that can sort of set themselves apart and try to guide the process a little bit. Nonetheless, I think that they're very healthy, but I think that you have to play in the regular order sandbox in order to reestablish some sense of process in Congress and let the outcome be what it may. I think Congressman Lipinski's on the Transportation Committee. They're going to be dealing most likely with an FAA bill later this year. The chairman wants to privatize the air traffic control system on that. There's a lot of very strong opinions on that. He will probably be able to get that out of committee, but whether it prevails on the floor is yet unknown. But I think in order for us to all know, you sort of have to run the process through. As opposed to there being some sort of packaging it with perhaps the infrastructure bill that President Trump has talked about. If you were to put that proposal in with a $200 billion plan to go invest in bridges and roads and transit systems across the country, the air traffic control system will become more of a footnote to the broader package. And so there's a way of running the process to get the outcomes you want. I don't think that would be a healthy outcome, but it may be the chairman and the leadership's way of achieving what they want.
And Kate, all eyes are obviously in the Senate now because the health care hot potatoes over there. On the House side, Eric's right, the breakdown of regular order has led to, basically the healthcare experts on the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Ways and Means Committee were not allowed to write the bills and put them through their committee. It was a leadership bill, and then the power of these rump groups like the Freedom Caucus, working with Tom MacArthur from the Tuesday group, start writing their own bill, and then it becomes, written by people who are not on the committees of jurisdiction and don't know anything about healthcare. So, and then the leadership is so powerless, they just let it happen. So this obviously happens on the House side. It doesn't happen on the Senate side at all. Talk a little bit about, the difference over there. Do you think that they're going to come to, Lamar Alexander will sit down and write some bill and he'll take everyone's input. And do you have hopes that something will get there? I know once it comes back to the House, it will go back to become a bouncing ball again. But if you could, that's sort of the next big thing. Everyone's waiting for Republicans to move their agenda based on trying to get health care done. Do you think the Senate can sort of, tidy up the process and produce a bill?
Well, the very unique thing about the Senate compared to the House is the individual relationships that exist between senators that doesn't exist for maybe but a fraction of the House. And in the Senate, there's a problem that, again, with the parties, they only meet with themselves and lunch with themselves. But in the case of healthcare, I know for a fact that the senators' lunches, which, from the outside we laugh. I remember working in the House and saying, do senators really lunch for 2 hours every day? Is that really a thing? We just shut down everything that the senators can lunch? But it's actually probably one of the most productive things that happen on the Hill because they're talking to each other. They're actually talking to each other, which is a unique and in private. And having, you rotate a lot of who hosts those, and so staff occasionally has access to see it, and it's amazing. It's what should happen all day, every day, with both parties at the same time. Maybe not always behind closed doors, but it does help in a lot of ways because, if Susan Collins says to Mitch McConnell, I'm really concerned about this, he can't just say, I don't even know who you are, and walk away and deal with my staff. They have a personal relationship, and he has to see her every day, and that's a real concern, and her opinion matters just as much as someone on the committee. For Mitch McConnell, it always comes down to the numbers. I'm not dismissing that, but I think it's more of a unique process and something that could be looked to. And then, I was thinking about the longer work week, and I have just a unique perspective maybe because of working for, maybe you feel like this too, working for more centrist, worked 20 years for centrist Republicans, and, I would pray for the minute we could send them back, not just to get away from them, but because getting them home gets them away from leadership. And getting your member away from leadership and hear from their constituents is exactly what I would want to happen all the time. Because I didn't want you to listen to Tom DeLay.
Right.
I didn't want you to just hear what Mitch McConnell wants you to do. That Mitch McConnell is not voting for you when we get back there. You don't have to go to the Chicago Tribune and talk to Mitch McConnell about that vote. And so the reality becomes a little distorted when their peer group is their leadership. And it's a high school mentality where you want to be the good kid, that's getting the attention, and you're the cool guy and whatever, that gets recognition from the coolest kids on campus. And that is an irrelevant process to what you're here for.
That's a very good point for the Tuesday, Thursday. So I want to ask both of you about your concept of what regular order should be. And this concept actually that Kate raised of privacy, I remember conference committees. There hasn't been one in a really long time, but then the House passed a bill and the Senate passed a bill, they'd get together in a room, and there might have been some earmarks, but there were private discussions, and they opened them up eventually. But when they were in private and people could be quite blunt with each other, they compromised more quickly. And now it's sort of, Joe Biden's on the phone with Mitch McConnell at midnight, but it's usually done in private for a reason, because that's where people break it down and give in. So I'm just interested, you can start in sort of what you think regular order should be or can be, not impeded by the minority, not, too much time loaded up with poison pills, so that you never actually get to a final vote. As an experienced legislator, where should we go with what is realistic for regular order? I don't know that we'll ever see it again, the way that we sort of think of it, but.
Well, I mean, I made a big point about the authorization
Yeah.
process. And look, the reason why authorizing committees are also important is what we've discussed here. That's the place where a lot of members worked on a bipartisan basis.
Right.
You know, when the committees were working, there was an awful lot of cross-pollination between the parties at the committee level.
Yeah.
And they used to be able to bring bills out then that were supported by both the majority and the minority. So that making the authorization process work does have some salutary effects, you know, across the entire mechanism of the Congress. The second thing I would do for regular order is open rules. It used to be that most bills came to the floor under open rules. Right. Open rules meaning that any germane amendment could be offered and debated and voted upon.
Germane.
Germane amendment. Well, in the House, you have to have a germane amendment. But what that led to was the minority being able to actually put their proposals out
Right.
and have them voted on. And so I spent 18 of my 20 years as a member, as a member of the minority. And so at the end of the day, we knew we were going to lose 99% of the time. But at least we got to make our arguments
Right.
under open rules. When you have closed rules and basically the majority decides all the amendments that are going to be brought out, what you do is end up frustrating the minority, and they have no other outlet except to do things that you know, disrupt the process.
Right.
And so I think, you know, I think going to open rules as the way in which you function most of the time would be a very good part of a regular order situation. Open rules simply say, bring the bill out, and anybody that has germane amendment gets to offer it.
Do you agree?
Yes, I completely agree with the open rule. We need more openness in the process to allow for debate. You're right, there are times where you know you're not going to win, you don't have the votes, but you're there to represent your constituents and to make the case. And there are times where it's a policy that you can get bipartisan support. I also agree with the post-enactment conference committee process and in improving that. I had several bills that actually got passed, but then I didn't really understand where the process went from there and where it was going to really end up from a conference standpoint, because it really went to the hands of the committee chairs and, again, leadership to decide whether or not those bills were really going to move. And as a member, that was very disempowering for me to not know how to contribute to the process beyond the committee. I would say that the committee structure in general, beyond just the appropriation process, we need that across all the committees. There are some committees that are less partisan. I was on Natural Resources, great committee, we got stuff done. But I was also on Oversight and Government Reform and Financial Services.
Right.
Not as bipartisan, it was more ideological. But there were times where I could find a Republican member who would work with me on an amendment process to get something through, because I knew without them, it wasn't going to move. So we just need that more open process and real legislative
So
debate.
the closed-door conference committee is not really something you guys are...
I've never participated in one. So.
Let me give you an example of how this process actually worked for real. I spent a lot of time on the House floor. The members knew I was going to be on the House floor. The majority knew I was going to be on the House floor. I would get a call late at night sometimes from committee chairmen who would say, if you look on page 36 of my bill, you're going to find something you won't like. Now, I don't like it either, but it was put in my committee, and I'm going to defend it on the House floor. But if you were to offer an amendment to strike that provision, now I would have to defend it. But
I wouldn't mind.
But if let's say you got 150 votes, it would become a controversial part of my bill.
Right, and we might pull it.
Then when we went to the conference committee, we would drop it in the
Right.
conference committee as a controversial provision and so on. So, and look, that depended upon a lot of trust between the people involved in that.
That's right.
So
you're not gonna rat them out.
The chairman knew that he could trust me. I knew that I could trust the chairman on that, and so on. But that's the way the process can work if you have it open and you have it functioning and so on. Everybody gets to get a little bit out of it, and so on, and it makes it pretty easy. I would have lots of members come up to me afterwards and say, "How did you find that provision in the bill?" I looked at it with all gobbledygook, and I said, "Well, I read these bills very carefully."
I want to open it up to questions. There's 2 mics, one there and one there, for anyone who wants to pose a question to anyone.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. My name's Brad Fitch. I'm with the Congressional Management Foundation. And first, I want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing to raise these issues. You all have talked about the importance of committees and how the power has been dissipated and destroyed. And I'll give you a statistic I stumbled on when looking at vital statistics on Congress. And yes, that's what I do as a hobby at the Congressional Management Foundation, is look at vital statistics. And I was looking at, just as one metric, the total number of hearings held by the House of Representatives from 1986 to 2011 dropped by 75%. Just the total number of hearings. And I think you've both talked about, and both the members and the staffers have talked about, the lack of power. And we see it at CMF. This is really one of the keys to the solution, is restoring powers to the member, because they don't have an investment in the legislative process, so they'll buck leadership. So leadership has no power over them. When leadership wants to influence members of Congress, they hire their super PAC to take out ads in their district now. They don't take away committee assignments. Talk to us a little bit at all levels, at all of you, about how we can restore the power at the committee level for the committee members, which might give them greater investment in the legislative process.
I'd like to hear from both of you on that, because I hear your frustration as a member who came at a time where everything's so centralized. You weren't empowered at the committee level. You'd obviously worked at the state level where you were, and you get here and your leadership is doing everything without you guys. I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
Well, we've talked a lot about process. For me, it was really more about legislating. And the idea that we have so many complicated, complex, important issues that need to be addressed in this country, and it didn't seem like it was getting addressed because of the process. And to me, we have it backwards. We need to focus on the legislation and let the process get in line with that. And it does go to empowering the members. Now, I listen to members who have been here much longer, and I respect their service because they were here in the days where the committees were strong and the chairman made decisions about what was going to be included and what wasn't. Now that doesn't really happen. I mean, and it's a much more staff-driven process, even on the committee structure, to where they're deciding what's going to move. And
At the behest of leadership.
Behest of someone, not at the behest of
the members.
The members sitting there pushing the button.
Yeah.
And so all that needs to be corrected in order for members to feel more empowered and really to just do their job.
Congressman Walker.
Yeah, well, I'm basically agree with that, and the point is that the committees feel powerless because at the end of the day, their bills don't get to the floor. A lot of the authorization bills die in the Senate. Even if they get out of the House, they go over to the Senate and die, and then so the members say, what was the use of that? I cast some tough votes only to have the bill die.
That's the fear on the health care.
Yeah, that's a major fear on health care. So there are some structural problems in terms of having this happen. But again, I come back to the fact that if you obeyed the rules that said that you cannot spend a dime unless it has been properly authorized, then all of a sudden you empower the committees in a way that forces the system to say, hey, we better get an authorization in place for the Justice Department that hasn't been authorized in 30 years, or else we can't spend any money for the Justice Department.
Right.
But as soon as you start waiving those rules, and saying, well, obviously we've got to have the money spent, As soon as you go down that road, we get to where we are now, where we just shrug and say, well, if there's no authorization, there's no authorization.
Right.
And then you have really taken the power away from the committees themselves and ultimately from the members. Because if you have committees that are really functioning, there were many times when you basically had to remind staff that I'm one of the people in here that has an election certificate, we need to make certain that you understand that this is the direction I'm going, whether you like it or not.
Right.
So,
And how about the two of you on that subject? I mean, I think that the Democrats seem to be a little more grumpy about it than the Republicans, but the Republicans feel it as well, that their members come here and get shut out and they don't get enough experience legislating. They don't get to work on the issues their constituents elected them to solve, and they just feel like they're just going through the motions and that it's all controlled, that they're A, in the minority, so they're more frustrated, but then B, it's controlled by leadership. But I'm interested in your thoughts, both from the House perspective and or the Senate perspective.
Well, I know it's low-hanging fruit, and I'm not necessarily blaming the media, but it's why not? Is CNN going to cover that hearing to review the efficacy of NOAA?
Does it?
Or
But
NIST?
does if a tree falls in the forest? I mean,
Right, but what is the
isn't it still
incentive?
supposed to happen?
But what is the incentive for a member of Congress to spend their time doing something in a vacuum that no one in the American population is watching?
If their leadership, if the bill is going to get out of committee and it's going to get to the floor, that's the incentive. Is the leadership is going to open up the process. Then, I mean, you'd still want your bills to pass even if CNN didn't cover it, right? That's the incentive. Is right now it's bogged down because the leadership won't even let the committees work.
Right, you have a Benghazi committee hearing.
We had a lot of those.
And you have, a NOAA authorization hearing. Which one are you going to?
But
you're on.
But are you going to tell your
committees.
constituents you were in the Benghazi hearing,
Yes.
or are you going to tell them that you were in the
100%.
NOAA reauthorization?
100%. You're absolutely going to tell them that's where you are. On either side.
Yeah,
Maybe this is the difference between the Senate and the House. We realize we're not going to be on CNN. But I think,
C-SPAN, though.
I think something on the order of half of the Congress has come in since 2010.
Right.
It's had an enormous amount of turnover, and so few members have something to go home and say, here's what I've done in Congress. They don't have earmarks, so they can't say, that bridge I got for you. And they have the inability to come home and say, public law XYZ is the one that I passed. Even though it's not that important to every constituent, if it's something the member's getting done, it's showing that they're productive and that they're active in Congress. So, I think that there is a value in doing this. You have, a lot of these suspension bills passing on the fly-in days and the morning afters, and then they go nowhere in the Senate. Is there a different approach to that? And is there a different approach in committees? I remember one instance in my experience where the member I was working for wanted to do something on veterans. They had a veterans hospital in the district, big veterans community. And so they went to the Veterans Committee, in which they didn't sit and said, do you have something I could work on? And the committee had been working on an omnibus, and they sort of cut out a section of a bill and said, introduce this, and it will, ultimately end up in a broader package. And so it takes a little magnanimousness of the members, of the chairman, of the leadership to say, why don't we empower the rank and file a little bit more? If we give them something that the committee staff or something that's important for their district, do some of the work in terms of figuring out the legal language on it, they offer it as an amendment or they introduce it as a bill and it ends up in something bigger. You've made the committee process work, you've empowered the members. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish where you're going to give every member a bill and then they go to come home and say, like School of Rock, we got it.
But it would help.
But yeah, I think it would help. I mean, with Mr. Lipinski, we spent 3 sessions of Congress, 6 years trying to get a bill passed that simply required the administration to have a strategy for helping American manufacturing. Just a strategy. Every 4 years, you come out with a plan, here's how we're going to help American manufacturing. And it took, an enormous amount of effort to get that passed. But now it's law, and it's something he can go home and tell his constituents, I got something done. Yeah. And that's too rare. It's too many post office namings and nothing else.
Sir, you're next.
Thanks very much. Brian Alexander, I'm a professor of politics and government at Washington Lee University, and was a former American Political Science Association fellow in Senator Jack Reed's office. So you guys have done this excellent job, I think, touching on the numerous issues, the systemic and the structural problems that are facing Congress, and lead many people to this conclusion of dysfunction, right? And there are many books, including one by Mr. Frost and Mr. Davis, and you alluded to one by Professor Thurber. Others, volumes are written on the question of dysfunction. But one of the things that strikes me as an observer, but also from my experience in working on the Hill, is that from the perspective of individual members and perspective of individual staff, it's not dysfunction. It's very smart, very ambitious, very hardworking people working within sort of the strategic and the systemic limitations of what they can do, and doing as much they can do within those constraints. And those constraints lead everybody to do things that are still maybe at the aggregate dysfunctional, but at the individual level, folks work very hard and do very well given the opportunities put before them. So I know that I want to, with that sort of background, I want to ask to Kate's earlier point that when members respond to constituents calling in, re-election, of course, is the big priority, but responding to constituent demands and constituent concerns is always a priority. I mean, whether it's not necessarily headline stuff, it could be, tending to a member or a constituent's concerns on a VA issue or whatever it is. So we know that folks, when they call in, that members are often responsive. But to Kate's point, often it's just the loudest voices on the extremes that are the ones calling in. So maybe not to me as a political scientist, but to the folks in the audience or to the folks who may be streaming this online, I'm asking the panel, if you could have the constituents call in to make a request to get over this dysfunction, to change the incentive, what would you want? What should constituents call in to say that we need this to change in some capacity? What would that step that if you were to respond to a constituent request, well, what would those steps be?
That is an excellent question. What should voters do? What should constituents do to try to bring progress and support these reforms and bring change? What's their duty? Yes, Eric.
I guess in a word, I would say compromise, because as Kate said, you're hearing from the margins who are trying to pull you away from the middle. And I think I would disagree that there is a sizable middle. We just don't hear from them. That's I think, the biggest part of the American body politic, but they're fairly silent, and they're the ones most frustrated with Congress. But you're hearing from the extremes, and they give you a sense that they're bigger than they are, and so it pulls members more to the polls. So if somebody were to call up and say, the Affordable Care Act was great, but it had some issues, and this American Health Care Act, I don't know about that. Can't you guys get in the middle and find something out that works for all of us? And that would be fairly extraordinary.
Sounds helpful. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
But to connect those dots, the thing that you had just said before, there is such an interconnectivity of leadership of both sides. I don't want to speak for the Democrats, but there's such a feeling of centrists being expendable at least on the Republican side. It's an expendable group. So we hear you, we understand, that's what you want, we don't care. And that's just, that's continuously the cycle. That is the minority of the majority. It's the minority of the base, I would say none of the base of the party. So it's expendable. And because it's connected because of redistricting and because of how the seats are traditionally, they'll say, okay, well, I think the wrong argument is that, we'll just get a more conservative person in that seat. Typically, those seats end up going to the other party.
Right.
And so it's a false narrative, but it's one that prevails in the system so strongly that there's not a lot of, you're ostracized. The members that do feel that way are ostracized. In Tuesday Group, the centrist Republicans in the House, that was 20 years ago. I hate to do the 20 years ago thing, but 20 years ago, those were liberal Republicans. Mm-hmm. that doesn't even exist anymore. And that was 25 very liberal Republicans, that when you did the chart of who voted how in red and blue, there was a crossover of Democrats that voted with Republicans and Republicans that voted against their party more than the other party. And there was the Blue Dogs and the Tuesday Group folks that were flipped in each other's lanes. And that doesn't, now it's like, it used to be like this. Now it's just like touching a little, but it's very rare because the leadership doesn't allow it.
So what would you have liked your constituents to have done?
Well, I'd like to just say a couple of things. Number one, to Kate's point, I think part of this is the changing demographics of the members themselves, too. The fact that in the House we now have more people of color, more women than ever before serving in Congress. And there have been times where the middle, those that were centrist, were hearing so much from their constituents back home that they did challenge leadership and say, no, we aren't going to vote on this bill. We're not going to walk the plank on this because it's not good for me back home. And I know there were members who were more targeted than I was, who were given passes to vote that way. Now, some people who are on the margins, you're kind of held to a different standard. And there were times where I was just saying, that's against my district. I can't vote for that issue because I represent a district that's 52,000 miles, that's rural, that's urban, that's suburban, and that issue's not going to play with me back home. To your point of, in the end, what are we here for and who are we working for? So what I would say to the voters to affect change is engage.
Yeah.
If they called more, if they wrote more, if they emailed more, if they did more social media telling their members, this is what I want you to do, and there was a loud crescendo of public opinion, that will move the body. But right now, we have too many people that are disengaged from the process. And so nothing is changing.
But the people who speak are in an echo chamber of their own opinions on either side.
And so what I'm saying is there's so many more individuals.
Yeah, that don't even engage,
that
are in the middle.
There's so much power. If I had 50 people call or write or email on an issue, I knew that was representative of 500 or 1,000 people. So you are empowered as an individual to call or write or email. And I know every day when we had a big vote, I would ask, how many calls did we get on this? What are people saying back home? Because that's how I knew, the pulse of the community, aside from being back home in the district. And then the last thing I wanted to say is the constituent work. I completely agree. Being a member in the minority, freshman, I realized really quickly, I'm not going to get a lot of bills done. So what I can do is work on behalf of individual constituent issues to get them resolved within an agency, to get a grant pushed through, to get language in an executive order. And we were more successful in those efforts and really had a return on investment to constituents that I was able to go back and talk about those real results rather than a bill not getting through, knowing that it wasn't going to pass. So I think that's really important for members to focus on is constituent service and constituent work.
I couldn't agree more with his last point. I mean, the main thing that I wanted to hear in my office from a constituent calling was, please help me, because the chances were that we could probably provide some help somewhere along the line. If we didn't have somebody in the government had a solution, we knew people out in the community that could come in and help that person and so on. And that gave you a lot of latitude in terms of your ability to legislate when you had lots of people out in your district who knew that you were there to help them when they asked for help. The other thing that it would be good for congressmen to hear from time to time from their constituents is, I understand that I'm not going to get everything I want.
Right.
Ronald Reagan used to say, if somebody is with me 70 to 80% of the time, he's my friend, not my enemy. The fact is that too much of what we hear is from people who say, if I don't get exactly what I want in the bill and so on, you have failed me. Well, the fact is you can't run a legislative system. You can't make the system work if everybody absolutely insists on every T crossed and every I dotted exactly the way they want it.
Sir, you're next.
Thank you. My name is Braden. I appreciate all the panelists. This has been an excellent forum, and I thank you for the archives for putting it on. So I just have a quick question. So we've kind of discussed, the five of you have, how there are much fewer competitive districts than there used to be. And there's a lot of, in the academic literature, there's kind of a lot of debate as to why that is. But one argument that's been really compelling to me is that the ideological disparate nature of the last few sessions of Congress has been in large part to an increasingly polarized electorate. So there's evidence that suggests that people are just becoming more polarized, be it due to their news consumption habits or even just the people they associate with. So to what extent can these procedural reforms that we've talked about and kind of the other reforms that have been mentioned fix a broken Washington when really it's just Congress people responding to the rational incentives that their district provide, which is polarization? So I guess my question is, can we really fix the problem in Washington if the problem exists in the voters in the districts?
I'd just like to add one thing to the end of that question, and then I'm going to let you all answer it. Is there an incentive to motivate moderates, anti-partisans like me who are disgusted, to turn out in primaries? What would happen if you sent more moderate voters into primaries and just messed them up? And I'm just interested in your thoughts on that, because I'm not totally convinced. I think the middle is bigger than the two extremes, but they're louder. So if we all found out when primary day was and we started getting motivated, would the most reasonable candidate win who was willing to go out and take a courageous vote? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I
Or
want to respond to his point, because I think it's an excellent point. I mean, look, the whole country's become more tribal. We've divided ourselves into tribes, and we can all go to our own information sources now that feed our opinion and so on, and we don't have to listen to the other side. The genius of the Congress is that if, in fact, it works right, all of those viewpoints and those tribal viewpoints and so on can be debated in one place, and where people can get to listen to why somebody might have an opinion on it. We're not listening to each other anymore in this country, and as a result, we simply don't have the kind of national debate on a lot of these issues that we should have. In the Congress, you can do that. Dick Gebhardt said that one of the things that is true is that Congress and its debates are a substitute for going to war, for fighting it out and so on, for getting physical on things and so on. We're moving too far toward the idea that violence is a solution and so on. In the Congress, you would have a chance to maybe debate these things in ways that assure that all these points of view get argued out.
Congressman, do you think it's just been decided? Everyone's sort of self-sorting and it's polarized at home, so it's going to be polarized here?
Well, no, I mean, again, some of it's structural. You have closed primaries. I mean, so people can't participate in a primary in Nevada because you have to be of that party. Now, come in the general, independents are now a third of the electorate in Nevada, and they're the middle, and they swing from cycle to cycle. And one election cycle, they're Democratic, and the next cycle, they're Republican. So I think some of this is structural. I still have hope that we're much more alike than we are different.
Right.
We don't talk enough to each other to know that we share more in common than what we realize we don't. Rural communities that are struggling with health care are the same as urban communities that can't get access to health care. And when people can find those similarities, I think much more can be done. Now, I may be too optimistic, too Pollyannish, but I still believe that in the good nature of a human being to find those commonalities that something will be done. Now, there are these realities to kind of where people get their news, the fact that they're only talking to themselves in a silo. And so those are the things that we have to break open, because when we break open and we have a conversation as individuals and collectively, I think we can get a whole lot more done together than we can apart.
I'm running out of time, but I do want to remark that I always find that members of Congress are optimists. I always think it's so interesting. You're next, sir.
We wouldn't have got into the process.
I know. It takes a certain kind, cynics on the sidelines.
I think you need to get down to the basics of what are rules and what do words mean. The simplest things, like it's against the law to eat or drink on the metro, is that gibberish? When is it you flood of words and everybody says it's gibberish, I'm comfortable doing it? And the classic example for me is in front of the entrance to committee rooms. You had signs saying beverages and food are not allowed in the committee room, and you look, and it's obviously in plain sight violation, and nobody says no. When it did change a little bit was after the 1994 election. There were two new committee chairmen, Budget and Science, who took down the signs. At least they said, we don't go by it. And we need to get down to the basics of what do the words mean, and who means words. And when we get down to that, then we can build something sensible. Otherwise, we can't. And how did we get to this station? And how does Congress reflect us and our gibberish?
Do you think that there's too much of a sense when you go home that your constituents feel that you guys are entitled to your own rules and you get to do whatever you want? And I mean, I know, because I've covered Congress for so long, that you work really hard for not enough money to live in this area and at home. I know it's really hard to uproot your family or be away from them. I know how hard it is to tend to those constituents' needs, even though it's really satisfying. But do you feel that there's a sense that people feel that you get to do whatever you want and they have to follow a different set of rules?
I still remember my neighbor, when I got elected to Congress, asked me how soon it would be that the limousine and the Secret Service would show up at my house. And so, I mean, the fact is, I mean, they see you as somebody who is set apart, and one of the things you have to work the hardest at is to make certain that you go to the grocery store, you do a lot of things and so on where they see you in everyday kinds of activities and so on. And it's one of the reasons why being back home is valuable to members of Congress, because people get to see you in a little different
No one's
role.
buying your groceries when you're a member of Congress. And actually, Senator Shelby was always at my Safeway late at night. I was very impressed by that. Ma'am, you're next.
Thanks. I'm Jessica Toohey. I'm with the Congressional Institute, and thank you very much for your time being here. Over the last couple of years, the Institute has commissioned some research. We've spoken with independent voters, moderate voters, the middle class. We've done focus groups specifically with women voters, and I'll throw a couple of numbers out at you. About 60% of the country doesn't think that their member of Congress actually hears their voice. More than 25%. So this is through national surveys and focus groups. More than 25% actually think their member doesn't care. And as a former Hill staffer, I know that nothing could be further from the truth, but this is the perception that people out in flyover country, people who are outside of the Beltway bubble, this is really what they think. And when we looked at middle class voters, and specifically over the last election cycle, what they're thinking, the middle class no longer believes that their government values the work that they're doing. So these are some huge disconnects that are happening. And to your point about people being disengaged, these are the people who are disengaged because they truly believe they're not heard. And even if they are heard, that their lawmakers, the people who they go in the primaries and in the general cycles to elect, don't actually care what they are asking them to do. So one of the questions earlier was, what can constituents do to say to members of Congress, here's what we would like you to do? My question for the panel is your thoughts on what can members of Congress do, those in the offices, to let the middle class, to let the women voters, to let the independent voters know that they are actually listening to them. And it's not just, you've got to break through the noise on the polarized sides of the aisle.
Well, I'm jaded on this because I've worked, I don't think there's a better case study in a apathetic middle than the 2010 primary race in Delaware when I worked for Mike Castle, a wonderful man who had won, I think, double-digit statewide races in his career, and he had, in the 90s name recognition, he had 73% approval rating, but he was such a staple that it was so taken for granted that he would win that no one voted. And, Christine O'Donnell, who's not a witch, won by a few thousand votes. So,
And gave the seat permanently to Chris Coons, who will have it for life.
For life.
Well, I would simply say, in answer to that, is members of Congress make a lot of effort to go out and listen to constituents. I mean, members of Congress hold town meetings and do all kinds of things where they make themselves available to their constituents. It's one of the reasons why recently, and it's been on both sides of the extremes, the business of shutting down town meetings and making them in to places that people wouldn't want to show up is so destructive, is because it means that people who really do want to listen to their member of Congress are not able to do so. Beyond that, what I always found was you went out to things and you did things like fire engine housings and all of those kinds of things where the crowd wasn't coming to you, where you were going to the crowd and circulating among them and listening to what they had to say. So a lot of members make a lot of effort in that regard. It still doesn't overcome the fact that people do think that somehow congressmen are set apart and they don't know what the average person is thinking.
Yeah, but there are members who give other members a bad rep. And there are members who don't have town halls and who aren't doing outreach. And those are the members who get the attention.
Yeah.
We got representatives right now that won't have a town hall on health care because they don't want the outrage that's going to come from people saying you're going to take away my health care, or you're cutting Medicaid. I think as a member, there are times where you have to confront those difficult situations and hear people out. But to not engage with them, those members are contributing to the problem as well, because they're cutting off debate. They're not engaging with a certain group of constituents in their area, and it gives the rest of the members a bad name. And other outreach things that members can do, we did something like commuting with your congressman. We would ride a public bus and actually take our services and constituent team and do constituent work on a bus, veteran, Social Security, what have you. And people who never would come to a town hall were there on that bus, and they were like, you know what? I didn't even know this was available to me, or I didn't even know that I could call my congressman to get something like this done. It's very easy, simple things when you have a good staff, and I give it up to the staff because they're the ones who have to make those things happen. But just those little things can show members that you care, that you are listening, that you are engaged, and then hopefully they'll turn out and vote for you.
Those are excellent examples, and both of these members had done that you have to be where they are, because they're not always going to get in a car to come to a town hall. It's intimidating. They don't know if they can wait in line for a while, if they're going to be trouble getting parking. I mean, a lot of people are inhibited by that kind of thing. And to be where they are instead and show your presence is I think, is very potent. You're my last question. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll be quick.
We've run over time.
I think mine's a little bit more of a tactical question. I think we've heard a lot about why bipartisanship doesn't exist. We want more open rules, or we need to hear more for constituents. We need more staff, longer work weeks. I guess my question is more directed to the two former members of Congress. What can those that are in Congress now do, just without any barriers, to encourage more bipartisanship and facilitate this process that we're talking about tonight?
Besides join the Problem Solvers Caucus.
I'll say something that will probably be controversial and so on. They need to do more congressional junkets. The fact is that...
we saved the best for last.
No.
Yeah, because they spend more time...
Literally, I mean this. It was the foreign travel that I did as a member of my committee and so on, and as a part of leadership and so on, where we sat on planes for hours on end. We got to know each other personally. We traveled as Americans, not as Republicans and Democrats. And we did real missions and so on. These were not vacations. These were real substantive missions that we were doing together. Those people, on a bipartisan basis, were the people that I worked with closest over the years then. Having spent that time with them, they were the people I could go to and say, I need a co-sponsor on this bill. I need you to help me on the floor today. And so on. Those were the people that you could work with and so on. And and it's a shame now that we literally have members of Congress who say, I'm proud of the fact that I've never had a passport. And they don't travel together, and they don't do that kind of bonding that takes place. And I would say also that that one of the great blessings of doing that was when the trip was permitted to take spouses. The member himself paid for the spouses to travel and so on, but taking the spouses and so on because they got to know each other. And I would go home at times and say something about how terrible somebody had been on the floor that day and so on. They said, now I know her wife. I know his wife. She's a nice person. I'm sure he is too. And I mean, those are the kinds of things that ultimately make a difference.
I'll just tell a quick story. At our freshman retreat, that was the one time where we were all together, spouses and kids included, and it was
in both parties.
In both parties, there were 6 of us as freshmen that relocated our family here. I was the only Democrat. My wife got to know the other freshman spouses, and out of that experience, we would have lunch together outside that the spouses arranged and made the members show up to. Yeah. And at one point, Congressman Luke Messer and I went on hardball, or crossfire, with each other. And before he went on and before I went on, both of our spouses told us the same thing. Now, don't you go and say anything bad about him because I really like his wife and we're going to go to lunch again next week. And there is a lot to be said about that. And it's the simple making the connections, building relationships, and talking to each other, getting to know each other as human beings in order to be able to effectively govern and legislate.
Yeah, and I mean, I am heartened to say that a lot of those friendships, even amidst the gridlock, are flowering, and Bible studies and groups of people across party lines that you would never know, but we need more of it. I want to thank you all for your incredible perspective and your contribution tonight. Thank you.
Thanks.